So let's turn to imagination. Carney says, one cannot wager, one cannot chance this encounter unless one has freedom to choose. Such choice presupposes our ability to imagine different possibilities in the same person, to see the other before us as a stranger to be welcomed or rejected. In this responsive imagination, he says, is the condition for the possibility of the act of faith, which is, as he says, a belief in the possibility of the impossible, of a possibility beyond the impossible. Now, this emphasis on imagination is hardly new in the literature of spirituality, and it is certainly not new at all to Ignatian spirituality. As one great theologian, Bernard Lonergan, puts it, it is in the self-transcendence of the person that one can imagine a different way of thinking and acting when confronted with a reality that offers unconditional love. Imagination plays a key role in being able to respond to others with thoughtful moral deliberations. We could, of course, go back as far as both Augustine and Aquinas to hear of the role of the imagination. Theologians, such as myself, might recall Augustine's going over and over and over his experience of youthful theft. You know, my students would say, well, what's the big deal with stealing some pears? And I say, yes, but what was it about his theft of these pears that was thoughtless? He threw the pears away. It was an indication to him of the fact that he was doing something really irresponsible just for fun. So imagination presents us with an alternate vision and invites us to respond. So I want to venture the suggestion here that our imaginations need rekindling in our efforts at evangelization. We need to imagine the situations of those whom we encounter, their families, their worries, their financial situations. And if we are able to put ourselves in their places, we have a better sense of their needs and our ability to be with them in those particular needs. Now, Carney's second moment is humor. Now, humor may not seem immediately to be so significant when it comes to evangelizing. In humor, as the sociologist Peter Burr put it so well, we are confronted with incongruity. We think of the dignified person slipping on a banana peel, or, as someone like Jon Stewart does so well, the juxtaposition of mutually contradictory statements by prominent politicians and news organizations. I don't know about many of you, but I enjoy watching The Daily Show to figure out what really happened in the news that day. So he notes incongruity. Carney also notes incongruity. He describes humor as the ability to encounter and compose opposites, what I see as impossible and possible at one and the same time. Carney notes that humor is a creative response to enigma, contradiction, and paradox. What do we do when we're up against something? We make a joke. And Carney goes on to argue that Jesus' own life is itself divinely comic. It is filled with paradox. It sees life upside down, and it is a reminder that we are deeply and invariably creatures of the earth, humus, the earth. Ultimately, he says, though, humor is really about not knowing, and our realization that our ordinary expectations will be constantly disrupted and overturned in the face of the divine. Humor reminds us that we are not in control, no matter how hard we try to be so. Our response to this lack of control can be anger, rigidity, being overly serious, but once we let go of our expectation that we can predict or control all consequences, we can appreciate the uncanniness and incongruity of the human situation. Now, as a theologian, I have to bring in, of course, Thomas Aquinas. No less an authority than he argues that what he calls the lack of mirth can actually be a vice. He says that the one who is without mirth not only is lacking in playful speech, but is also burdensome to others, since that person is deaf to the moderate mirth of others. Now, while Thomas wasn't concerned in this context with evangelization, I think it is fair to say that he would agree that a life, including one's religious life, that is lived without humor is flat and lifeless, and certainly not one that will witness to new possibilities. The further point, as he reminds us, is that humor is related both to humus as well as to humility. Humility is that precise acknowledgement of our lack of control, our groundedness in the earth, not so much in a way that accentuates the worst of the unexpected, which can always happen, but that it shows how this unexpected dimension can be the source of new life. Basically, it's not up to me. Now, I think giving up control may be one of the most difficult things a professional faces. This is what we're trained for. Yet, control can be the enemy of new possibility. We might consider how a robust sense of humor, of not taking ourselves too seriously, might assist us in helping those entrusted to our care. As Carney suggests, this can be a window allowing us to encounter the other in all of his or her richness and complexity. The third moment is commitment. This, it would seem, is the key moment in the work of evangelization, how one decides, chooses, or responds. As Carney puts it, this moment is what he calls the movement of the wager that makes truth primarily, although not exclusively, a matter of transformation. Even a lack of response, in a sense, is a response, as the old motto from the 1960s put it. Not to decide is to decide. That was something from my generation. We would say that about the Vietnam War. Okay. Not to act is to act. One can think of Dag Hammarskjöld's knowing that there was a yes at some point in his life. And I would also observe that this point is, as Hammarskjöld suggests, not always a conscious and deliberate commitment. It's not this magical moment. The moment of commitment is when one's convictions become more than aesthetic or intellectual, although those two certainly play a critical role. So I have no doubt of the commitment of all of you here to your profession and to the work that we are all charged to do. That is, to create a community where our mission can be carried out. Our tendency, or at least I can say mine, is to get bogged down into the details of the everyday. Reminding ourselves of our commitment in imaginative and even humorous ways can be one way to do this. The fourth moment, discernment. Carney notes that this moment is not after everything, but is in fact simultaneous with them. As he puts it, we can't be naive in assuming that we humans are capable of unconditional or indiscriminate welcome to every other who approaches. In other words, you have to sort out how you're going to respond to this other. As another theologian so helpfully puts it, knowing is not just seeing, it is experiencing, understanding, judging, and believing. What is so important here is, as Carney puts it, there's always discernment to be made. At times, this discernment involves an intellectual judgment, and at others, it involves courage and perseverance. Now, the fifth moment that Carney describes is hospitality. And here again, it is to be understood in connection with the other four moments. As he puts it, if discernment is integral to the anatheist wager, this risk of responding to the uninvited guest, this doesn't mean that knowledge trumps love. Hospitality represents a profound openness to other possibilities of being, which require a kind of giving of self. Real hospitality is putting oneself in the place of the other, being willing to be dispossessed, to love the alien and the stranger, as difficult as this is. And Carney notes that unconditional hospitality is really the work of God, not of us, and that we can only hope to live this hospitality out in some human way. But one crucial point that he makes is that we're never, this is a favorite phrase of mine, we're never absolutely sure that we can absolutely grasp the absolute. We're never absolutely sure that we can absolutely grasp the absolute in any situation. So I would also note that Carney goes on to develop the idea of hospitality in relation to interreligious dialogue, which is a task that I don't have time for here. But it is a necessary task, especially when we minister to so many whose faith commitments may differ from our own or who do not have a faith tradition at all. With this kind of hospitality, we cannot arrogantly assume that we have the truth and others do not. Now, as I've observed throughout this brief exposition of these insights, these ideas are really not radically new. They find many echoes within the tradition. And I find them to be a helpful way to think through what it means to try and witness to the gospel in a way that can give freshness to the gospel in those to whom the new evangelization encounters. In our present context, which tends to be dogmatic, indifferent, these 5 moments have the potential to help us rethink how we might best approach the current crisis that we face. And I think as well that they characterize the way that Pope Francis is preaching and living his version of the new evangelization. So consider how each of these moments finds an expression in the ways that the Pope has communicated his understanding of the gospel. His imaginative challenge that the dying homeless person gets less attention than the workings of the stock market. His often self-deprecating humor, his commitment to the gospel, his discernment of what is appropriate in a particular moment, and his hospitality, demonstrated by his phone calls, his washing of the feet of children in a juvenile detention center, and his willingness to have selfies whenever anyone wants them. So truly, these gestures are ways of evangelizing and provide models for the rest of us to follow. So for my third section, and not too much more to go here. So the third section is the changed situation of Catholic healthcare in the new evangelization. So Catholic healthcare has undergone a sea change in the last at least 20 to 30 years, as has healthcare all over this country. Many of the institutions that were run or sponsored, often by women's religious communities, are now in transition with new corporate organizations, complex governmental regulation, and always cost consciousness. I am old enough to remember when my health insurance premiums were paid entirely by my employer. I mean, really, when you think about it, who does that nowadays? Catholic healthcare serves people of all different faith traditions and of no faith traditions. So how is the new evangelization relevant to the work of Catholic healthcare when mission officers, executives, doctors, nurses, and the many support staff at hospitals are not in the business of converting patients and clients? This is not what we're in the business of doing. We're in the business of caring. But my question is, can this be a form of evangelization? Those in need of conversion perhaps may not be the patients or clients. Well, the work of Catholic healthcare is to heal, comfort, and serve, and yes, sometimes to challenge, as the work of healthcare is also to try and engage patients and clients in better health practices for themselves and their families. But I think those in need of conversion, I dare to say, are sometimes those who are providing the services. Catholic healthcare can and does make a difference in the lives of all we serve, and it is up to us to embody our commitments in our work. So I would want to here turn to the example of women religious who have made incredible adjustments in their own self-conception and ministries over the last 50 years as an inspiration for the new evangelization as it applies to Catholic healthcare. Now, women religious heard the call of Vatican II for renewal and conversion as one that required their response in a new way, a kind of reconversion to the gospel, not just the community's rules and constitutions. Their response required a shift in imagination, a willingness to see what was really at the heart of their vocations. And in fact, in turning to conversion, the first and abiding consequence of turning to Jesus is becoming his disciple. So the point of this theologian's remark is that one's conversion is primarily to a person and a message, not to an institution. And while I'm not suggesting that institutions are unnecessary at all, rather the institution must serve the message and not the reverse. If the institution is not adequate to the needs of the mission, then the institution needs to change. And women's religious communities found their structures in need of change in order to be of genuine service to the church's mission, and they got changed. Institutions of Catholic healthcare are at a point where their own original sponsoring congregations are turning over to new management, many of them lay men and women. It is essential for those in executive positions to be able to take on the imaginative worlds of their founders, to understand the work that began under other hands. Hearing the stories of the founding congregation is one important method in this process. But even more important than those stories is knowing the stories of those with whom we work. If Catholic healthcare can make a difference in the world, it is not just in the label we give it, but how it sees itself both internally and externally. Catholic institutions don't just have a different brand. As good as some of those brands are, I mean, I actually like Loyola's very much. We also treat the human spirit. But they need to embody their mission within the institution so that all are contributing. Congregations of women religious after Vatican II reorganized themselves according to that spirit in ways that emphasized collegiality, mutual responsibility, and not simply obedience to superiors. And I would challenge all of our Catholic institutions to consider how we imagine ourselves as a community, as communities, multiple communities of co-workers. And the transition of women's communities also required patience in living with contradiction and incongruity. In Carney's words, this means a healthy sense of humor. The tensions that women religious experience today with regard to hierarchical structures are not at all new, and I think remembering this helps to explain the patience in the longer sense of history that is evident in so much of what is going on at present. Carney notes that humor is ultimately a recognition of the fact that we don't know everything. The one who does claim to know everything is the one who has no humor at all. His quotation is, "Lord High Executioners and Grand Inquisitors are incapable of laughing at the divine comedy of existence." And as any number of biblical scholars have observed, the message of the gospel involves a radical shift in orientation where the least are the greatest, the smallest seed turns into the largest tree, the good-for-nothing bum of a son gets the fatted calf slaughtered in his honor when he returns home. And while women religious may not strike us as the stand-up comics of the new evangelization, their ability to live with incongruity and paradox is unequaled and can serve as an inspiration to all of us. We do live in a time of incongruity and paradox, and I'm sure we all deal with the kind of regulations that we think, who made up this set of rules? But they may make sense to some official somewhere, but their implementation may just make things worse. Patients, students, clients are often sources of humor, although hopefully not at their expense, and so our own interactions with each other at every level are as well. And I think both academics and healthcare providers may be especially tempted to take ourselves too seriously. How can we live out the joy of the gospel, as Francis puts it, in situations that seem to make it burdensome and joyless? Now, the commitment of women religious needs little comment except to note its depth and its seriousness. And while I may often find the use of the theological language of marriage to be problematic in relationship to Christian discipleship, largely because of the way that it tends to overly essentialize women, Carney uses it appropriately in talking about commitment. He says commitment, in the sense of betrothal, is the movement of the wager that makes truth primarily, although not exclusively, a matter of existential transformation. Now, commitment is, of course, not exclusive to religious life. All serious commitments involve risk. If they didn't, they wouldn't be serious. So, a quotation from one sister here: "Unless a person, the artist of her own life, makes choices that involve her life in its deepest springs, unless she puts down relational roots through commitment, she continues to drift through life collecting experiences that cannot be fit into any frame of reference within which they have genuine or abiding significance, with which one's life becomes a whole. It is an act of courageous self-determination that is the highest expression of freedom in the human being." Now, I'm not here to question anyone's commitment to their work. Your presence here and simply your work, your very daily work in difficult situations, is witness enough. I would simply suggest here that commitment is at the heart of what we all do. One of the things that I hear so frequently from my pre-med students, in my nursing students in my classes, is that what their goal is It's to help people. Helping people is not just done by hands-on care, but spreads across an institution. Commitment is something that every single worker in a hospital or healthcare institution, from top to bottom, needs to embody. So the process of mission integration for all is central and needs to be encouraged and nurtured. Now, the process of discernment. How does one determine what is the best strategy to take in a particular situation? How does one navigate the complex financial, regulatory, and personnel issues that can cloud the basic mission of any institution? We don't need to be reminded that the world is complex, and the world of healthcare is even more so. What are the criteria for right discernment? And discernment, as some of you are no doubt aware, is central to Ignatian spirituality. One of the main points of discernment is the ability to listen carefully to oneself and to others. My suggestion here is that, again, we take our inspiration from the work of women religious and their transformations after Vatican II. In this process, all members of the community were involved in consultation. Ultimately, of course, serious decisions needed to be made, as they do for all of us. But a careful process of listening, not only to oneself, as Ignatius calls for, but also to everyone involved, can make the difficult process of decision-making more in line with gospel values. And finally, hospitality. This seems in many ways to have the most obvious connection with the work of Catholic healthcare. Catholic institutions are often the institution of last resort for those with the greatest need. So hospitality too comes with risks, not just financial ones. Carney writes, "We run the risk of being mistaken, but such risk is not groundless. Women religious have been open to the new possibilities of renewal, not knowing what would eventually result." In his words here are again, Carney's words here are again worth repeating. We never have absolute knowledge of the absolute. Our own tradition is grounded in the work of one who died a failure and whose followers abandoned him. To suggest that sheer numbers alone are the hallmark of the success of women's religious life or of the health of Catholic hospitals and healthcare institutions is most decidedly to get it wrong. So let me conclude very briefly. As someone involved in theological education and not directly in healthcare, at least not as a provider, I'm acutely aware that my own comments as I try to translate from theology to institutional mission may not always be on the mark. But I do think that we share many things in common. A sense that what we do is not merely a job, but also a vocation. That those whom we teach or care for are immensely precious to God, and I hope also to us. That our work is not simply delivering the curriculum, which is one unfortunate institutional way of describing what I do, or delivering healthcare, as if teaching and caring were simply ways of conveying a marketable object. What the new evangelization is really all about is reminding us that we are in service to the gospel. New and exciting methods of teaching or the latest in medical technology are not always what will serve the gospel best. It is rather the conversion of our own hearts and minds to a mission worth doing. Mission officers are those who set the tone for the institution. So my point today is that we use all of our imaginative, intellectual, emotional, and practical wisdom in fidelity to the values of the gospel. We may come from different traditions, but we seek ways of rethinking what it is that our vocations call us to do. We need imagination, humor, commitment, discernment, and hospitality in our thinking, teaching, caring, and service. And in this, we may perhaps warm the hearts and minds of our students and our patients. So in this humility before the absolute, we may hope to be credible witnesses to a life-giving mystery. And we owe ourselves and those we care for nothing less. So thank you for your attention.